Hello, my name is Ted Burns. I'm Senior Director of Political Affairs and RAPAC for the American College of Radiology, and I'm honored to be able to give this update and presentation about what's happening on Capitol Hill, or in some cases, what's not happening on Capitol Hill for the Texas RBMA meeting. And I wish I could be there in person, but sadly, with COVID, unable to do so, but hope to be there hopefully next year. So very quickly about the American College of Radiology for some background for those maybe not very familiar. The ACR has our headquartered office in Reston, Virginia, which is right by Dulles Airport. And we have roughly 250 or so staff members in that location. We have another office in Maryland for the AIRP training, which is a resident training for 4 weeks. We also have a DC office, which is a 12 staff folks. Our location is directly between the White House and the Capitol for easy access to the Hill for our different appointments and meetings with those members of Congress and congressional staff. And then we have a research office in Philly, which is roughly about, I believe, just under 100 or so staff folks. Specifically within our Washington, D.C. Government Relations Office, we have it broken down by legislative staff, political staff, regulatory staff at the federal level, and then state, leg, and reg. Like I said, about 12 or so folks in our office, pretty evenly divided between each of these 4 sections within the department. And obviously each has its own niche, but there's a lot of overlap as a lot of our issues, both from the legislative and regulatory perspective, as well as political, are all connected in some way, shape, or form. And as you can imagine, when we're looking at federal issues, or even for that matter, state issues, it's very difficult at times for us to make a determination as to what issues we want to pursue actively, what issues we want to monitor indirectly or more from afar. And we look at certain criteria. We obviously look at the impact it's going to have on the radiology profession. It's always important to look at the stakeholders, both those with us and those against us, to make a determination. Is it a major uphill battle? For instance, medical liability reform has always been a tough issue at the federal level because I believe about 85% of the composition of the Senate is made up of trial lawyers. So that's always going to be difficult for us to go up against folks on that issue. And if you look at the stakeholders who would be against that, the Trial Lawyers Association is one of the most powerful political arms in DC. So it depends who is with you. It depends even more so sometimes who's against you. The cost, the impact both to the radiology profession on a cost, and then the cost that it may take for us, whether it's political cost, legislative cost, the overall effort that it would take for us to pursue a particular issue at the federal level. And then, of course, the viability. We may have a great issue that we feel like we've got a lot of strong support for. We're willing to pay the cost for whatever it would take. And the impact on radiology may be significant. But if it's a dead issue on the Hill, then obviously that's something we take into consideration before we pursue it aggressively or not. For state issues, again, a lot of these criteria we look at, but we're really more of a resource and hands-off when it comes to state issues. We want to be sensitive to not, coming in and disrupting whatever type of infrastructure a state may have in place. And every state is uniquely different. Some states are very active legislatively with maybe the state medical society or with a hired lobbyist. Some states are maybe not as active and need the ACR to intervene a little bit more aggressively. But this is something that at the state level, we're seeing so much action at the state level compared to the federal level that I believe we're going to try to figure out ways to get more involved, again, without disrupting kind of the current scope of what's happening with each respective chapter at the state level. So when you look back to 2020 issues, The E&M issue, the E&M cuts, evaluation management, that was one of our number one priorities, along with surprise medical billing. And then you see the list of other issues. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is a list that is fluid, is a list that is constantly changing and being updated. And this list is also not in any kind of priority order other than the top two. And a lot of these issues are issues from year to year. So, we're still going to deal with E&M and surprise medical billing this year. We're still going to deal with a lot of these other issues this year and in years to come. And so, obviously, as other issues pop up, we add it to the list. But as you can tell, we have our hands full. There's no shortage of things for us to be fighting for on behalf of the radiology profession. So before we look at this year, I think it's important to look back at what we would call the 11th hour legislation last year, because there's a lot going on. There was the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, bipartisan majority of the Congress passed it in both chambers, signed by President Trump. And really, one of the major things this did for radiology and for a lot of other providers is it drastically reduced the cut that was scheduled. So we were scheduled for a 10% cut for radiology, and this legislation changed it to around a 4% cut, which is super significant. Obviously, a 4% cut is still a cut, but considering it could have been more than twice as much, we're pretty happy with that level of success. Now, that level of success is really just for this year in 2021, and then you're looking at phase-ins that go to an increase of a cut to as much as 7 to 8% in the next couple years. So if you want to look at the return on investment with the E&M issue, with all the effort that we put into it, getting that 10% schedule cut down to about a 4% equates to about $700 million in savings over the next 3 years. And if you factor in, we have roughly 45,000 radiology members of the American College of Radiology, that's about $15,000 per radiologist. Very, very significant again. And as I mentioned, the phase-in cut, if we are unable to get anything to change the status quo for this year, then effective next year, we're going to see a little bump back up, getting closer to, but not at that original 10% schedule cut. In addition to the E&M success, surprise billing was another issue included in that end of year legislative package. And this was a really interesting issue because it had many lives. It was like a cat, it seemed. Just when we were told it was dead issue by Speaker Pelosi or by Mitch McConnell's office in the Senate, it popped back up again, and then it would die down and pop back up again. A bunch of different bills that were specifically addressing this issue. The original bills that popped up that really had the most momentum, that got passed out of the committees in both the House and Senate, were really leaning pretty heavily towards the insurer side as opposed to the provider side. But fortunately, when we got down to the negotiations at the end of last year, we were able to really get some significant changes in language from the original bills. And some of those are highlighted below as far as the threshold for having what we call IDR, independent dispute resolution, getting rid of the median in-network rate as a benchmark, getting rid of the timely billing provisions, and getting language that would explicitly exclude Medicare, Medicaid, and workers' comp rates for the IDR process. I mean, these are all really big issues. Now, if we look at that, and we'll get into it just in a little bit, but the impact of that legislation, while overall positive, it's going to come down to how it's written in the regulatory process. So a bill passes through Congress, gets signed into law, and once it gets signed into law, then obviously the regulatory bodies come in and actually write the statute, and that's where the interpretation by the regulating community has to be consistent with the intention of the legislative community up on the Hill. So more on that in just a bit. Other things that were included that were probably a little under the radar of that year-end package, more language addressing PPP with forgiveness of the loans. There's a new payment model for radiation oncology that we were not overly excited about, and we were able to get a 1 year delay on that, working with Astro and some of our other colleagues in the House of Radiology and Oncology. Uh, the screening process, whether it's for lung cancer or more specifically in this case, mammography, is always a big deal for the radiology community. And we're very happy to get another extension for mammography coverage without the copay for women 40 and up, as opposed to 50 and up, which is the recommendation from the United States Preventive Services Task Force. I always think it's ironic that the United States Preventative Services Task Force is making a recommendation of screenings at 50, not 40. That seems kind of counterintuitive, but we were able to get an extension to delay that recommendation from the USPSTF to ensure that women 40 and up can get that screening without worry about copay. And then another issue, which again, very under the radar, but super important to so many other providers, in addition to just radiology, is expanding Medicare supported GME positions by 1,000 of them. And that's something that has really been an issue, again, under the radar, but super important as we look at the future of medicine and providers when we have so many retirements that are likely to happen over the next 5 years or so. So now that we've reviewed what happened in the kind of 11th hour of last year, we're looking ahead to Congress this year and what you can expect. Obviously, we have a new political makeup with a razor-thin margin in the House, and that margin is even tighter than reflected, actually. I need to update that, but it is very close between the Democrats and Republicans in the House. Obviously, in the House, you just need a one-vote majority in order to pass something. But for the purposes of getting or needing bipartisan support or issues being bipartisan or not, those ratios make a difference. And obviously, the tighter the margin and tighter the ratio, the harder it is for things to be passed at a higher bipartisan rate. In the Senate, you can't get it any closer than the 50-50 split we're currently at, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. And because the White House is controlled by Democrats, that means that the vice president is the tiebreaker in the Senate when there's a tie. And that means that Democrats, as by default, have the majority. And that has an impact on who the committee chairs are. In the Senate, you're looking at the Finance Committee, is Ron Wyden from Oregon or Patty Murray from Washington State for the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee. And while Ron Wyden and Patty Murray both have decent track records for wanting to be collaborative with the other party, that said, they still have their own personal political leanings, obviously, and those are much more left-leaning than obviously if it was Republican-controlled Senate and you had Republican chairs on those respective committees. So that doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. It just means, with them in control, they're going to pursue policies more consistent with their party. And obviously, with the new Democrat White House, we have a new administration at all levels and all agencies, including HHS, the Health and Human Services Department. And within that, you've got the new secretary, which is former Congressman Javier Becerra. Former Congressman Becerra was in the House, and he represented a district from California and was on the Ways and Means Committee, very familiar with healthcare issues. In fact, was a recipient of the Congressional Award for Radiological Excellence that the ACR gives annually to a member of Congress who's been particularly good on radiology issues. After he retired from the House, he went to serve as Attorney General in California and now has just been confirmed as the new secretary for HHS. Now, we have a very good relationship with Javier Becerra personally, as well as with his chief of staff. His chief of staff is the same chief of staff that he had when he was in the House that we used to work with all the time. And we've actually kept that relationship through the years, even when he was Attorney General in California. So does that guarantee us anything? Certainly not. Is it helpful to have access and to be able to communicate with their office? Absolutely. And so we're hopeful that we can have open, honest discussions with the secretary and his staff, and hope that we can make some headway with certain things within CMS and how things are written into law. Time will tell, but it's still promising that we at least have that connection. And then obviously between COVID and what happened on the attack on the Capitol on January 6th of this year, the Capitol's in lockdown mode. If I was talking to a member of Congress late last week, and he was telling me, he said, "Hey Ted, even if you wanted to come up and visit me in my congressional office, I'd have to go through the Sergeant of Arms to get approval. They go through this whole process. It may take weeks. Whereas, previous to COVID and to this attack, earlier this year, I could just pop into a congressional House office building and then go directly to the congressional office and say hi to a member of Congress if we had a relationship and we could set something up. But now they're really in lockdown mode. It is very difficult to have face-to-face access with members of Congress, which makes it difficult for us to educate them and lobby them on all these radiology issues that are so important to our community. So with the tight margins in the House and in the Senate, and just the overall nastiness of the political environment we're in, and it's almost like a nervous laughter that I give there because it's just so difficult and awkward. Where it used to be, Democrats were very dependent on their base to pursue their policies, and the Republicans the same way, but they would still interact with each other, even if at least on just a personal level. But now it's gotten so bad, you don't really have the same level of relationships across the aisle. And that's certainly the case professionally as well. I mean, not only do they not want to be friends personally, but they don't want to work together professionally. And that makes for a very difficult environment to get anything done. Now, one thing that the Senate has, which is kind of a loophole legislatively, is the reconciliation process. So in the House earlier, I referenced that just a simple majority, one vote, majority can get you legislation passed in the House, but in the Senate, the majority of legislation requires 60 votes, not just 51 out of the 100 senators. So in this environment, when it's tied 50-50 and you're the Democrats in control, you have to find 10 Republicans to come over to your side and leave their base of support to vote on an issue with you. That's a tough task. So this reconciliation process exists where really you just need, similar to the House, you just need a simple majority to pass something out of the Senate, but there's limits on how often you can use reconciliation, and there's limits on what it can be used for. In particular, it has to be used for spending and revenue bills. So that's something that has already been used once in the COVID relief package earlier this year. And we'll talk about moving forward how that's going to be handled later this year. If you want to look at healthcare policies that we're expecting or we're hearing that are getting traction, supporting family medicine, reimbursement for family docs, it's obviously been long known that the family physicians have been very left-leaning, and they were right out on front with Obamacare and even public option in some cases. And so that has endeared them to the Democrats, and Democrats, as a thank you, want to look out for family medicine and increase their reimbursement rates. Telehealth is a huge issue that, as a result of COVID, a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle realize that that's a great resource for their constituents, particularly those in rural districts where you may normally have to have a patient who's a constituent in a rural congressional district have to travel 1, 2, 3 hours to the doctor's office, and then that same length of a trip back home, oftentimes having to miss work for a simple appointment or a procedure. And now they can get so much done in the telehealth that the members of Congress see the great value in that, and they want to continue to pursue that. Scope of practice is always a huge issue, And I think that will continue to become an issue as people are really focused on access to care. And I think there's a real push from the Democrat House and Senate majority to say, you know what, we don't care so much who's providing the care as long as there's some access to some care. And we certainly want to make sure that while patients get access to care, that they're actually getting good care as well. They want to strengthen Obamacare in this Congress. That's certainly the case. There's no desire to repeal Obamacare by the Democrat majorities in the House and Senate. They'll only look to strengthen that. And then mental health parity is a really big issue. Mental health parity, not just those providing mental health care to patients, but also the mental health of all providers. Obviously providers being on the front line during COVID pandemic over the last year and plus months has really shown a light on just how burnout a lot of physicians are, what type of danger they've been willing to put themselves in the line of fire, dealing with COVID. And so there's a real concern by members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that it's important to make concessions to enable physicians to feel like their own mental health is okay in order for them to continue to have the incentive and desire to practice medicine and provide for their patients. And like I was saying earlier, there's still a lot more work ahead on so many of these issues. Some of them legislatively, like the E&M, some of them from the regulatory front, like surprise billing. So we're just going to keep cranking away, keep pursuing all the issues that we can. It works both ways, though. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, you have to also have that appetite on Capitol Hill. And so right now, there's a lot of fatigue on Capitol Hill, particularly on healthcare issues, because they've been doing so many COVID bailouts. They want to get to other issues like infrastructure, building roads and bridges and things of that nature. And that was an issue that the last 2, 3, 4 years they felt that there was pretty good bipartisan support about. But now it really depends on just how expensive that infrastructure bill would become. And there's talk now that they may use reconciliation in order to pass an infrastructure bill just because it's become so big with so many parts in it. One of our lobbying consultants used the expression the other day, and he's a Democrat, and he said infrastructure is now a code word for spending. So if it's an infrastructure bill, it's really a spending bill. And he admitted, even though he's a Democrat, he said it's gotten to a point where it's gotten a really, really high price tag, which has scared off a significant amount of all the Republicans who had bipartisan interest in that bill. And as a result, making it difficult to get 10 extra Republicans in the Senate, therefore maybe them needing to go down the reconciliation process. So now I'm going to talk more about some of the political activity that we do with the American College of Radiology. The American College of Radiology is a 501c3, but has limits on advocacy action in order to maintain its tax-exempt status. So as a result, we've created the American College of Radiology Association several years back, the ACRA. And within the ACRA is RADPAC, the political arm of the college. And, a lot of folks don't like the money involved in politics. They don't like politics at all. But the reality is this is the process. This is how it was envisioned to work. And until something drastically changes to the process, we would be foolish to not engage in that process. It's legal. It's heavily regulated by the Federal Election Commission. We have to file every month the money we raise from radiology members throughout the country. And then we have to also disclose every month how we contribute money to members of Congress. So it's not like I just go up to Capitol Hill with a big old, stash of cash and give it to members of Congress and say, you better vote for our bill because you want my cash to get reelected. If that was the case, I would be in Hilton Head Island playing golf every day, retired at, less than 40, years of age, but that's just not how it works. So it's really important for folks to understand that uh, while they may not like the process, it's a legitimate process, and it's the current process that we have to play within. So we're going to play, and we're also a bipartisan PAC. A lot of people, want us to give only to Democrats or give only to Republicans, and we really just care about radiology. It doesn't bother us if it's a Democrat who's really supportive of radiology or a Republican supportive of radiology. We just want to get the most amount of support we can from Capitol Hill on our issues. And however we get there, we get there. So when we're looking at money that we raise, contributions in, there's two different ways we raise money. We raise money, hard money from individuals, and we raise soft money from corporate practices or practices corporate accounts. We can get as much as $5,000 a year from a contributor, and we can use that money, that hard money, to turn around and support a member of Congress, again, who's very supportive of radiology issues. I would say practice contributions make up about 70% of the money we raise per year. And by practice contributions, I mean radiology practice, let's say, has, let's say, Austin Radiology. They have upwards of 100 radiologists or whatever it is. And if they all decided to give to RadPac, and let's say it's $100 each or whatever, they can wire us that money, and that would be hard money. That would be individual money coming out of their paychecks, basically. Alternatively, soft money would be if Austin Radiology said, you know what, we want to help RadPac, but we don't want to really go through the process of having every individual having to set up an extra payroll deduction process. So we're just going to write you one big corporate check, which of course would be fine too, but that's soft money, and the designation of that being soft money means we could not use that money to give to support supportive members of Congress for radiology. We could use it for other political activities, which are equally important, but there is a limit on the use of how we can use those funds. And there's no limit on how much we can receive in the way of corporate contributions as that limit from individuals. So this is kind of a cute little way to say it when we're talking about being bipartisan, but RadPac has an R, RadPac has a D. Again, we don't really care the party affiliation of the member of Congress we support. We only care about their support of radiology. And we have a bunch of different criteria we look at. Are they good on healthcare issues? Were they in the state legislature, in the state House, the state Senate? Were they, as members of Congress, supportive of our issues previously? Whether that means co-sponsoring a bill or being a primary author of a bill or writing a letter to their colleagues asking for support on a particular issue, even writing a letter to CMS on our behalf or making a call to CMS on our behalf is a big help. So we look at all those types of factors. We look at their background. Obviously, if they have relationships with our radiologists locally in their district, that has impact. What committees of jurisdiction they sit on. So do they sit on a committee of jurisdiction with healthcare, or are they on the transportation committee where we probably don't really look to them to help us as much because they're dealing with transportation issues, not healthcare issues? Are they in leadership? People get mad all the time. Well, you give to Nancy Pelosi, we don't like her, or you give to Kevin McCarthy, the top Republican in the House, we don't like him. Again, if you're in leadership, you're at the table, you're making decisions, and so we need to get in front of you. And the only way we get in front of you is by fundraising events, and I tell people this all the time. Members of Congress, they may miss votes, they may miss meetings with constituents, they may miss committee hearings. They don't miss fundraising events. So if you want face-to-face with a member of Congress, it's got to be a fundraising event, and you've got to support them, and that's just the way it works. Now, obviously, again, it's all by Zoom, but even still, you've got to raise the flag for the profession and make sure you're heard. And we also look at rising stars. That's a lot more difficult to forecast. We've had a lot of folks we've supported earlier in their congressional career thinking that they were going to be the next big thing, and some of them have panned out wonderfully, and some of them, kind of like picking stocks, have not. You kind of look at a bunch of different criteria to make those determinations, and you only have so much control over it. But the fact of the matter is, members of Congress always remember who supported them early and often before they became a star. So you're trying to forecast that and identify those folks, and then really support them if you think that they can make it, be a difference maker down the road. So what we do with the money once we have it, we talked about our criteria for contributing, but there are limits. We can only give $5,000 to a congressional primary, and then $5,000 to a congressional general. So it's only $10,000 in the course of a 2-year election cycle. Most members of Congress have what's called an LPAC, a leadership PAC, and you can do an additional $5,000 a year each of the 2 years during the election cycle. So at the very most, you can give $20,000 really to a member of Congress's efforts politically. How we do events, we get invited to about 100 events a day. We only participate typically in about 350 to 400 events a year, but Congress is only in session about 130 days. So really, we're still going to about 3 events or participating in 3 events per day Congress is in session. Most of our events that we participate in are what we call doc events. These are events that are hosted by various specialty physician organization PACs, only because we know at those events, healthcare is the only thing being discussed. You're not going to get conversations about the financial market or transportation or immigration or agriculture or other industries at a doc event. You're only talking about doc healthcare issues. So we tend to do the majority of those events. We host about 10 events a year ourselves, where we are kind of tasked with raising anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 per event. We'll be hosting an event later this spring for Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and the goal for that event is $50,000. If we don't hit $50,000, it's not considered a successful event. Obviously, a ton of pressure to produce, but at the end of the day, if you can say, hey, Senate Majority Leader Schumer, we just raised you well over $50,000 from the specialty physician PAC community, we're definitely going to have his attention and we'll have his ear. Doesn't mean he'll agree with us. Doesn't mean there's any guarantee that he'll do anything, but at least we have his attention and we have the ability to educate him on these issues. There's times where we'll go on trips with members of Congress to build a better relationship with them, get to know them more personally, and that's always a helpful thing as far as being able to build that trust and really have their ear and have them understand what it is our members do. And then, like I said, pretty much everything now is by Zoom. I have not been to a face-to-face fundraising event since March of last year, which is very odd. Usually I do well over 100 events myself a year, but it looks like we're going to start doing face-to-face events probably this fall. So that'll be good to get back into doing that with members of Congress more directly and help the visibility for the college. Looking specifically at Texas, Texas has always been a pretty high-performing state for RADPAC. If you look at the job they did in 2020, Texas raised the most contribution dollars for RADPAC out of any other state. And really, that amount of money for that amount of contributors is incredibly significant, and obviously we're very appreciative. Big shout out to Associates of North Texas and South Texas Radiology Groups, respectively. These are what we call outstanding practices that are at or around 100% of their radiologists contributing to RADPAC. But if you think how big Texas is, with well over 90 radiology practices in the state, you only have 2 that have met that outstanding practice criteria over the last year. And you think how much money Texas contributed to RADPAC, considering that fact, certainly there's tons more room for growth for Texas. And this is why it's important. Like I said, it's something that everyone's doing. I mean, it's not like we're the only ones playing in this crazy political game that people don't like. You look at all the other specialty physician organizations; they all have PACs. I always have my top 11 list because even though top 10 is a more traditional list, I got to include our cardiology people. But if you see what they raised, last year they raised just under $300,000. We raised more than 3 times that. That means we can do 3 times more fundraising events. That means we get in front of members of Congress 3 times more than cardiologists. And I'm not trying to pick on cardiology, but it just goes to show how competitive this is and how important it is. Now, that said, look at the anesthesiologists. They're going to twice as many events as we are. They're raising twice as much money as we are. And I guarantee you, while we may have great relationships with our counterparts with the Anesthesiology Society PAC, they're not going to sit there at a fundraising event and say, well, Congressman, Congresswoman, we raise way more money than radiology. They can't be here today, but this is what they would be talking about if they were here. No, they're not going to do us any favors. So that's why it's so important for us to have the resources to be at as many events as we can and make sure that if these other specialties, PACs that are ahead of us are at events, that we can catch up and also be represented as well. We started a new thing, the Chapter Champions Cup. This was something that was supposed to go live this year, but we couldn't anticipate COVID, obviously, when we came up with this concept, but we came up with 2 big trophies. One is for number of contributors, and one is for highest percent of contributors within a chapter. And the goal of this and the vision of this is that at the ACR annual meeting, when everyone sat in their section for their chapter with their state flags and everything else, and the name card that says Texas, Texas, Texas at all the tables for all your counselors and everything, that if Texas were to have won this cup, let's say last year, this cup would sit at that table with their Texas flag through the entirety of the meeting as a sign, hey, everyone else, look at us. We just won the Chapter Champion Cup for RadPac. We also thought of it pre-COVID. This could almost be like the Stanley Cup, where you walk around and people may be drinking out of it and having all kinds of fun. And obviously, we're probably not going to do that now, but this is a real symbolic show to the rest of the country which chapters are the most outstanding. And so, obviously, North Carolina was able to come through last year and be the first recipient. But knowing down in Texas how competitive the folks are, my guess is you guys might be interested in trying to win this cup for next year. And really, at the end of the day, this is why all of this is so important. If you look at members of Congress, there are 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. And if you look at that total number of 535, only 30 have any kind of healthcare background. And really, of the 30, only about 11 or 12 are actual MDs. The rest are maybe non-MD providers, or maybe they were a healthcare insurer, or pharmacist, or some other type of role within the healthcare industry. But you're looking at a very, very small percentage, really about 3-4% of Congress that has, real hardcore medical professional background. Now, the irony is 100% of Congress is voting on healthcare issues, talking about healthcare issues, considering and debating healthcare issues, but less than 10% have any real knowledge of healthcare issues. And so this is why having our RadPac be well-funded so we can educate members of Congress, educate the 90% plus members of Congress who don't know much about healthcare, how healthcare really works, defining the issues for them so it's not defined by the insurers or other folks who may not be as provider friendly. It's a big deal. I mean, the radiologists have obviously spent a good part of their career training and specializing in radiology care. And if someone's not there to protect that voice, we will see a deterioration of radiology in the future. There's no doubt about it. Whether it's through scope of practice, whether it's through AI, whether it's through other areas, we need to be uh, ensured that the voice of radiology is heard on Capitol Hill. And that's why that's so important. And really, there are a bunch of ways that you guys can help, whether that's hosting a member of Congress to visit your radiology department or your radiology practice. Show them what it is you do. You've got tons of really cool toys with all the imaging equipment. Uh, that's very memorable for a member of Congress to come into a radiology practice, see and hear that you spend millions of dollars for the latest and greatest in technology to provide patient care, and they leave with that image. I mean, no pun intended, but they really do. And so we need to do more of these visits. And now that hopefully this fall and this winter and into next year, there's going to be a lot more face-to-face interaction with members of Congress. We need to continue to make that a point of emphasis. Educating your radiology groups and departments about the value of RADPAC, and I'm even throwing in the TRS PAC, the state PAC for the Texas Radiological Society, which I know is very active as well. I don't care how much people give. I just want people to give. I want people to support our efforts, support our voice, so we can basically be the voice for you. I would say participating in the ACR Hill Day, or even RBMA has their own Hill Day that they do in September usually. Bob Still, the executive director of RBMA, has done an amazing job making RBMA a real advocacy power player. And kudos to him and all the folks who support him through RBMA. And it's important to be heard with members of Congress, and whether that's through meetings with them locally or meetings with them through Zoom and Capitol Hill. Those efforts are really impactful. Getting engaged at the state legislative level. I know in Texas, I believe it's every other year the state legislative bodies are meeting and debating issues. I think it's every other year. But getting to know local members of the legislature is huge, because members of Congress usually will come from being a state legislator. And so if you get to know them early in their career, at the ground level of their career, build a relationship with them. For those who do run for office at the federal level and are successful, you already have that built-in relationship. And then you will be surprised the impact you can have. I think a big deterrent for a lot of folks is, well, I don't really want to spend a lot of money for RADPAC. I don't want to spend a lot of money for TRS PAC. I've got a lot of other places to spend money. I don't have a lot of time. I don't really have time to meet with members of Congress or to walk around with a member of Congress for an hour to talk about our practice and what we do. But that's really not a major significant commitment when you think of how much that impact and relationship can really have. Going back to the E&M, ROI, if we have more members of the radiological community supporting our efforts, we're going to have more relationships with members of Congress. We're going to have higher return on investment, and that's only going to benefit the practices, the radiologists, the business managers of the practices. It's going to improve things for everyone. And so you don't have to be committing thousands and thousands of dollars. You don't have to be spending hours and hours of time, but you write $100 check, or you host a member of Congress one time in the year for an hour. That's really a pretty manageable amount of commitment over the course of a year that could really pay dividends in the aggregate if everyone else is doing it as well. So I want to leave that last slide. Here's my contact information. I try to be as responsive as I can by email. Of course, if you want to send me a text, feel free to do so. Part of the other reason I'm not down there personally uh, at that meeting is just because I coach baseball and we have a baseball tournament. In full disclosure, for my son, he's on the travel team, and so that's why I prefer to be text instead of called. I don't want to be on the baseball field coaching in the baseball tournament and then someone calls me, but text me, email me, and I'm more than happy to get back to you and answer any questions, provide any resources, and kind of guide you down the path of becoming as engaged as you can in our joint effort to make a real positive impact, not just for the radiologist, but for the patient. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity, and wish everyone well. Thank you.